Welcome to Under the Curve. Today we're diving into one of the biggest shifts in economics, the credibility revolution. In 2021, the Nobel Prize went to David Card, Joshua Angrist, and Guido Imbens, and for good reason. They completely changed how we figure out what causes what in the messy world of public policy. So let's rewind. Before the 1990s, economics was ruled by theory. And the theory was clear. If you raise the minimum wage, jobs will fall. That was the law. But here's the problem. When economists tried to prove this with data, things got messy. Why? Because of something called endogeneity. Basically, whenever you looked at outcomes, you couldn't tell if the policy caused the change or if some hidden factor, like motivation or an economic boom, was behind it. And that meant economists were stuck. They needed experiments. But running experiments on entire economies wasn't exactly possible. And this is where David Card came in. He realized that sometimes the world hands you experiments, what we now call natural experiments. In 1992, New Jersey raised its minimum wage. Pennsylvania, right across the border, didn't. Perfect setup. Card and Alan Kruger compared fast food restaurants on both sides, before and after, and the result? No big job losses. That was a shock. It went directly against decades of economic dogma, and it made me wonder, could one clever study really overturn what looked like a basic law of economics? But Card didn't stop there. He studied immigration too, and he found that large inflows of immigrants barely nudged the wages of native low-skilled workers, maybe down 1 to 3% in certain cities, but nothing like the disaster many predicted. However, critics weren't convinced. They said, fast food isn't the whole economy, and they worried the results were too local, too narrow. So, yes, Card had evidence, but the fight was far from over. Now, Card's work was bold, but here's the catch. Why should we trust the results? This is where Joshua Angrist and Guido Imbens came in. Think about a government giving out training vouchers. Some people use them, but others don't. That's messy. But Angrist and Imbens showed that if you use the instrumental variables method here, you're not measuring the effect for everyone, only for the group who actually changed their behavior because of the policy. They called this the local average treatment effect, or LATE. And that was huge, because it told economists, look, you're not measuring a vague average effect, you're measuring something very precise. However, here's the catch. Late only applies to that specific group, the compliers. And that makes me wonder, is something so narrow still useful for policymakers who care about everyone? But even with those questions, the method spread everywhere. Difference in differences, instrumental variables, LATE, you name it. And suddenly, economists were studying everything. Coal plants and asthma, scholarships and education, even giant shocks like German reunification. And when one natural experiment wasn't enough, they built new methods like synthetic control, basically creating an artificial control group by blending data from other regions. And today, we're layering these methods with machine learning. But here's my concern. Do we risk losing the transparency that made these designs so powerful in the first place? Of course, none of these tools are flawless. With difference in differences, everything hinges on the parallel trends assumption. The idea that the treatment and control groups would have moved in sync if the policy hadn't happened. But we can never actually prove that. And if it's wrong, the whole result wobbles. And with late, yes, you get precision, but only for compliers. Policymakers often want answers for everyone, not just a sliver of the population. So there's always this trade-off. Do you want a smaller answer you can trust, or a bigger answer you can't fully rely on? Card, Angrist, and Imbens didn't just add new tricks to economics, they changed its DNA. They moved us from theory-heavy debates to data-driven evidence. And yes, there are limits. But the point is, Thanks to them, policy today leans less on assumptions and a lot more on proof. That's it for today's episode of Under the Curve. The credibility revolution shows us that sometimes the world itself runs the experiments, and it's on us to read the results. But here's the question I'll leave you with. Should policymakers act on narrow but credible findings or wait for broader, messier evidence? Next time, we'll keep exploring Nobel-winning ideas and how they collide with real-world policy. If you like this episode, hit follow, share it with a friend, and remember, good policy isn't just about theory, it's about proof.